Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, it is an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to address this body for the first time. I have the challenge of succeeding Senator Bob Dvorsky, who I know is respected and admired by so many of you, and he leaves enormous shoes to fill. I was not planning to seek the floor this morning until a chance encounter last night, and I thought to myself, what would Senator Bob do? So here we are. After several legislative receptions last night on my way back to my car, I found myself walking alongside a man who appeared to be homeless, headed in the same direction, pushing a small purple bicycle with a deflated tire, towing a cart filled with his earthly possessions. At the time, it was negative 32 degrees. He was on the other side of the street, and we walked parallel to each other for about a block. In my mind, like most of us would, I was immediately wondering if he had somewhere to go, if he had a plan, if he even knew how cold it was going to get. After walking about a block, as these thoughts consumed me, I called out to him to ask if he knew where he was sleeping. He said he didn't, so I beckoned him across to my side of the street without any real kind of plan. He crossed the street and he started looking hesitantly at the curb, so I helped him push his bike and his cart up onto the sidewalk, and we kept walking a bit more. Before long, we ducked into the lobby of a hotel down on Locust Street, and he sat down on a bench to start warming up. Mr. President, it is not an exaggeration to say that he had ice frozen into the hair of his beard, and frost had formed on the brim of his baseball cap. He slowly peeled off 2 layers of gloves and asked the young man behind the counter to fetch a cup of hot coffee. I asked the man his name. His name's Rick O'Brien, and I asked if he had a plan for the night. He said he wanted to ask his stepmother if he could stay with her, but he wasn't sure if she was home. So I searched Des Moines Emergency Shelter on my phone, and I called the first place that popped up. A woman on the other end answered promptly, and I asked if they had any space, and she said they were out of beds, but they did have a chair. A chair sounded better than freezing to death. I asked if there would be space for Rick to store his bike and cart. She said that he'd have to lock it up outside, which wasn't ideal, but it was better than freezing to death. I said okay and hung up. Rick then asked me where the shelter was, and I told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, that place has bugs, it's terrible." I asked him if there were any places in town that didn't have bugs, and he said, "No, they're all terrible and they all have bed bugs." I don't know if this is true, this is what he told me. So we called his stepmom, who he was hoping to stay with, and as luck would have it, she was home and she was okay with him stopping by. Now she was only about a half mile away. And I don't know how far you walked last night, Mr. President, but I sure didn't want to walk a half a mile in negative 32 degree weather. I wanted to give Rick a ride, but his cart and his bike wouldn't even come close to fitting in my car, so we stayed in the lobby and chatted a bit more. We talked about life, and he told me that he had gotten hooked on drugs when he was about my age, and he did some things to try to be able to afford drugs while he was hooked. He spent some time in prison. He got out of prison a decade ago, but it was 2009 and he couldn't get a job. So even though he says he spent the last 9 years clean, he's been unable to secure permanent housing during those 9 years. And I don't know how much of this is true, it's just what he told me. But he had no idea who I was, beyond that I had invited him into a hotel lobby and handed him a cup of hot coffee. We talked for a while as he thawed, and the ice in his beard melted and slowly dried out. He could only hold the coffee for a few short moments at a time because his hands were so cold that he couldn't bear the heat for more than just a few seconds. We kept talking for about maybe 15 minutes total before Rick decided that he wanted to head out to get to his stepmom's place before it got even colder. So we went back out into the night, we walked together for about another half block, and then our paths diverged, and Rick was gone. Mr. President, I'm not sure if my intervention made any difference, but if nothing else, I'm glad he had the chance to warm up and get something hot to drink. And I'm going to think more about what I can personally do in situations like this and what we as a legislature can do together. I'm starting to understand that as lawmakers, it's our responsibility to triage and to weigh the various needs of all our constituents. And yet, it is certain, Mr. President, that some of our constituents died last night or will die today and tonight because of the cold. In fact, just this morning we were informed that a person was found dead on the University of Iowa campus behind Burge with no shoes and no coat. And what my thoughts keep coming back to is this. I almost didn't say anything. I almost didn't call out to Rick across the street. I almost just kept walking without saying anything. And I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't be sharing any of this at all right now if I had chosen to just keep walking. I'm glad I was wearing a suit and tie and an overcoat, and that I'm tall and white and male and confident enough to barge into a hotel lobby where I wasn't staying, and without any concern as to whether or not the person behind the counter would make a fuss or would be willing to get a cup of hot coffee if I asked him to. I mean, many of us in this chamber have that privilege and have that confidence. And I'm starting to understand now in my third week here that all of us have the power, if we choose, to help people like Rick. In fact, the state of Utah, which can sometimes get almost as cold as Iowa, has figured out how to reduce its chronically homeless population by over 90% since 2005 and has wound up saving the state money along the way. What I find especially distressing about the situation, Mr. President, beyond the immediate human and moral cost, is that our veterans, the women and men who have put their lives on the line for our country and for our freedoms, are dramatically overrepresented among our homeless population in this state. And Mr. President, it turns out that tonight, the last Wednesday of January, is the night of the annual point-in-time homelessness assessment, when nonprofit workers will fan out throughout our state to count the number of people who are without shelter at this point in time. So I'd ask that we all keep in our thoughts and our prayers tonight those who are doing the counting and those who are being counted. And to please consider making a donation to your local shelter at home or the shelters here in Des Moines. And Mr. President, if we have the opportunity to do so, I hope that you and our colleagues will join me in support of making sure that a cold night is never a death sentence for anyone, let alone our veterans in the state of Iowa. Thank you, Mr. President.